Hello and welcome to YHTV's Magical Medical Tour. This is episode 75. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Christina Suzama, and with me is our wonderful medical guide, Dr. Glenn Woolman. Hello, Dr. Woolman.
Greetings, Christina, and how are you?
Fantastic. Very excited.
Fantastic, yes. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Magical Medical Tour. I'm Dr. Glenn Woolman. I will be your medical guide along with Christina today as we travel through another quadrant of the healthcare galaxy, searching for optimal health. And today we have with us, in a return performance, Dr. Gary Winston. I would like to suggest that everyone go to episode 11, Toxins and Toxicants, to learn a lot more about Dr. Winston. But just briefly, he has his PhD in biochemistry. He was the chair of the Department of Biochemistry at Louisiana State University. He was also the head of the Department of Toxicology at North Carolina State University, and he was the chief toxicologist in the Ministry of Health in Israel. And we're going to find out what he's doing today. And we're going to be talking about water. The title for our show today is Water for a Thirsty Planet. So, Christina, if people want to reply or ask questions for Gary, how would they do that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Glenn. At any time during this presentation, you can ask a question by submitting it into the comment box at the bottom of the screen and just scroll down, type it in, and be sure to click submit. We'll make sure that your question is sent to Dr. Gary Winston for an answer. And keep an eye out because usually the reply comes quite fast. Thank you, Glenn.
You're welcome, Christina. So, Gary, welcome. I'd like to welcome you back to our show. How are you?
I'm fine, Glenn. Thank you. It's nice to be here again.
Yeah, it's really good, and it's a great topic.
And this time I'm actually coming to you from the Colorado School of Public Health at the medical campus at the University of Colorado, where I'm teaching a course in water quality and public health. So it fits nicely with the theme of our talk today.
I was hoping you would do it from somewhere floating down the Colorado River.
I would have preferred it.
In that case, we'll have to be right beside him, Glenn.
Yeah, definitely. So, Gary, as the medical guide, I want to tell people where we're going to hopefully go today, where the flow is going to be. We want to get into a little bit of your background in water. We want to talk about what's going on in water around the world and global public health. That's an important topic for us. We'll talk about maybe some water availability, the sources of water, whether we can sustain it, possibility of how we're polluting our water supplies. Maybe we'll get into some waterborne diseases and contaminations. Might even talk about the privatization and corporate water, and to see maybe if water is going to be the oil of the future. And we will talk more about that. How does that sound to you?
Sounds great. Sounds great. They're all important themes.
Let's get started. The first thing is, I think before we really get into a lot, why don't you talk to us a little bit about just water itself, the physical, chemical properties, just so that we're all getting the same picture that you have.
Sure. I don't think there's any mystery as far as the chemical properties of water. I think we all know that water is H2O. In other words, it has 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. And it's a molecule that's quite polar because the oxygen, which has a negative charge on it, is quite separated from the 2 hydrogens, which have positive charges on it. And that contributes to its properties. But I don't want to go into detail about the chemical properties because it would confuse a basic audience. Rather, what I would like to do is talk about the importance of water in the body and what it does. And I can tell you that the chemical properties of water are what give it the physical properties that I'm going to talk about right now in the body itself. For one thing, water does help us regulate our body temperature. It's very, very important in that respect. The other thing is, it is sometimes referred to as the universal solvent. Now, that doesn't mean that as a universal solvent, it dissolves everything. What it means is water as a solvent will dissolve more substances than any other solvent will. And this helps us very much because it will dissolve minerals, amino acids, sugars, things of this nature, so that the nutrients can be carried to the cells in the water, which is part of the blood. That's very important. So it helps dissolve the nutrients and then helps to carry the nutrients. It also moistens our tissues, as you know, it's very important, so that we don't get dry eye or dry mucous membrane. And it lubricates our joints, which is very, very important. So those are important properties as it pertains to the health of a human being and why we need to drink nearly at least 2 liters of water a day.
I think I'm glad you did that. I think getting into the actual physical properties for our own health is much more important than learning about the polar and electromagnetic forces at this point.
Sure.
So thank you for that. Did you want to show a movie to us?
You know, I thought, Glenn, it would be a marvelous idea to start this show with a very short video that I got from National Geographic showing the extent of water and the breakdown of water on the planet. Because even though 98% of our, we actually have 326 million trillion gallons of water that we can find on our planet. But 98% of that 326 million trillion gallons can be found in the oceans. Actually, what's available to us to drink, the fresh water that we drink, is less than 1% of all of the water on the planet. So I want to show this video because it illustrates it so nicely and so dramatically in a way that National Geographic can do it best.
Well, that was great. I really enjoyed that. I'd like to watch that probably a few more times, Gary. Thank you for sharing that with us.
You bet.
So we need to talk about lots of things with water. The first thing that I think we need to talk about is, where do we get our water?
You know, Glenn, let me preface this by saying that, all of the water that we have on our planet today is the exact same amount and the exact same water that we've had for 4.5 billion years when this planet formed. So one would think, well, gee whiz, if we still have the same amount of water, how come it's not accessible to us really? But water comes to us in two forms: groundwater, through what we refer to as aquifers, and surface water, which comes to us through lakes and streams and brooks and rivers and things of that nature. So the waters that we get come from the surface of the planet, or the waters come from deep in the ground. That's why sometimes we have to dig wells quite deeply in order to tap water supplies. As a matter of fact, I will mention that one of the largest aquifers, an aquifer is just simply a contained groundwater. The Ogallala aquifer actually was responsible for making and contributing to what we call the breadbasket of America. But we've tapped that so greatly. We have withdrawn that water so much during irrigation processes. 70% of our water goes to irrigation, but we've tapped that tremendously. And in so doing, I have a very nice slide that shows the impact of irrigation withdrawals back in the year 2005. It's only getting worse. I'd like to, I would like the audience to be able to see that slide. I assume they can see that slide, yes?
Correct.
Okay. Well, if you notice in the slide, you can see that as we go from almost white to the darkest blue, we're talking about water withdrawals in millions of gallons a day. Millions of gallons a day. And we have now withdrawn so much water from the ground for use in irrigation and use in industry, which requires about 20% of our total water. We're withdrawing it at such a rate that we can actually see sinkholes forming all over the United States because we don't have the water pressure to hold up the ground anymore. So the ground collapses. And you can see in that slide a house almost being swallowed up by a sinkhole. So
Wow.
it's really tremendous because we are so much overtapping our groundwater. The surface waters aren't quite so bad, but there's a problem with the surface waters, and that is that they tend to get polluted much more easily than groundwater. And I think it's logical because in order to pollute groundwater, we have to get the pollutant to percolate way down through the ground, whereas surface waters, just simple runoff, whether it comes from an agricultural watershed or an urban watershed, it flows off into the surface water and creates a tremendous amount of contaminants. Now, I'm not sure what slide. I don't see the slides from my end. I don't know exactly what slide is up there at the moment. Glenn, what slide is up there at the moment?
We're still looking at the irrigation withdrawal.
Right. I think we want to take a look at this atlas of America's polluted waters. What we see here is the darker the shade of brown, the greater the percentage of waters that are impaired in the United States. So you can see, for example, in Florida, There's a tremendous amount along the eastern seaboard, along the western seaboard, and near the Great Lakes. And that's greater than 26% of the water supply as actually being impaired by runoff from these various sources, whether it be from urban runoff or agricultural runoff. So it's a very, very important problem. Now, I would also like to point out that we have many, many reasons why water does get polluted, especially the surface water. For one thing, acid mine drainage. We have in the state of Colorado alone over 8,000 abandoned mines, and they create this acid drainage which contains cyanide and arsenic, and it flows into our surface waters. And you can see here the urban runoff coming through this pipe. I mean, that's coming from industries, and it's coming from sewage, and it's coming from runoff from roads. I mean, this is a very, very serious problem. Then we can talk about the agricultural runoffs and the agricultural pollution, pesticides and fertilizers being sprayed onto our crops that run off when we have storm events. In fact, fertilizers run off so incredibly during storm events that it actually creates, now imagine this, the fertilizer fertilizes the plant so the plant will grow. Well, interestingly, algae is a plant. So when fertilizer runs off from agricultural lands into our waters, it fertilizes algae.
Oh, no.
And creates these very harmful algal blooms. You know, you folks that live in California, you're very familiar, I think, with red tide that happens during the warm water period, and it gets into shellfish, and it can actually be lethal. But we forget, because so much is made of red tide, that freshwater algae contains many, many dangerous toxins. And in fact, it can get so bad. I'd like to show you a slide here. It'd take me a second. I'd like you to notice in this slide, this is a toxic blue-green algal bloom. We call it a harmful algal bloom. The name of the algae happens to be microcystis, that produces a very dangerous toxin known as microcystin that has killed children, it has killed plants, it has resulted in no fishing orders where we cannot fish the waters from Lake Erie, which destroys the economy around Lake Erie, because imagine this, if you can't fish, the fishing industry dies, the boating industry dies, the sporting goods industry dies. And look at this. This is Lake Erie. It runs from Toledo all the way across to Buffalo, New York. This would be Buffalo, New York in the upper right-hand corner. So it's about 268 miles long. But if you look towards the western basin, I think you can see the western basin labeled there near Toledo. Look at that. This is taken from a Landsat photograph, a satellite photograph high above the earth, so you can see the entire Lake Erie, and look at that algae that has formed in the western basin of Lake Erie. It is very, very serious. It's only one kind of algae. There are many freshwater algae that cause very harmful disease states. And it is so dangerous that it actually forces the city of Toledo, which gets its water supply from Lake Erie, to spend an extra $3,000 to $4,000 a day to treat the microcystin toxins from these harmful algal blooms. Now, where do you think that $3,000 to $4,000 a day comes from? It comes from the consumer. that has to pay the water bill. So in that regard, that's another one. So you have, and the other thing is, remember that as water runs off from agricultural watersheds, it carries manure from cows, pigs, chickens, and so forth, which carry very harmful bacteria, viruses, protozoans that can cause disease states. So today, there is mandated by the Environmental Protection Agency a manure management program where the farmers must manage the manure and make sure that it is composted so that it does not contain, and is fumigated so that it does not contain these harmful algae, these harmful bacteria and viruses and so forth. I don't know if anyone's ever had, if anybody's ever had the disease cryptosporosis. Yeah, it's a very nasty, nasty disease, and it also comes from agricultural runoff. So anyway,
so how does that affect like the fish in the lake?
So much so, Christina, that at times when we get harmful algal blooms like the ones that I'm showing, like the one I showed on the screen, they actually have to order that a no fishing order, and many of the fish do die.
Oh my gosh.
Many of the fish die, and pets that eat the fish will die. It's a very serious problem, and we do our best to try to manage agricultural runoff. And in order to do that, we have to implore farmers to use best management practices. And that means don't spread the fertilizer heavily during the winter time when the ground is hard and a storm event comes in and can wash it off down through a river and into a big lake basin like this. So it's a serious, serious problem.
Wow.
And I just thought that maybe it might be interesting. We hear so much about pharmaceuticals in water. The Associated Press had a big story about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, warning us that we are starting to find pharmaceuticals and personal care products showing up in our water beds and in our water streams. And they come from many, many different sources. I've got a little slide here that shows the pathways of the pharmaceuticals and personal care products release into the environment. So when we treat livestock, for example, with antibiotics, it runs off into the water. When we store manure and the manure forms a slurry and a big storm event comes about, flows off into our water. People dump their used medicines down the toilet, and it flushes into the sewage system and then on into our water supplies from this wastewater treatment and from medicines and manufacturing processes all over the world. Fortunately, it has only shown itself in levels that are at parts per trillion. That's a very, very low level. But it's still a concern because it's growing. We don't know how to get it out of the watershed. It may not prove to be a real problem to human beings because it does get cleaned up when it passes through the water processing plant, through the utilities. But what can happen and what is of concern, you get a bunch of antibiotics in the water with a bunch of bacteria in the water, and the next thing you know, you have the potential of creating antibiotic-resistant microbes. So there's several. I could do an entire Yoga Hub magical medical tour on just PPCP releases into the environment. But I don't think we need to go that way today.
That's the next show.
Right. One thing I did want to ask, Gary, is I heard you say that it can get into the waterbed.
Into
And
the
I'm
water
wondering if you're
supply,
talking
sure, the
about,
streams, the lakes.
so you're not talking about the waterbed that I sleep on. I'm
Who
starting to
knows?
panic thinking all the things that might be growing underneath me.
You know, who knows? You may be.
What did you fill that bed up
no,
with?
because I'm sure you fill up your waterbed from your tap. And if you're
No,
filling it
I actually had it shipped in from Lake Erie.
then I would worry about it. If you punched a hole in it, your water would come out green.
I don't want to do that. So, Gary, you've told us a lot about polluted water and different aspects of this, and I'm a little nervous. How do we know where we live now that when we turn on our tap, that water is safe for us?
Glenn, it's an interesting question. It depends where your water comes from. If you live in a large city, if you live in a major city that's greater than a population of, let's say, 5, 10, 15,000 people, I live in one that has over 1 million people, your water probably comes from a Los Angeles water purification plant. If it comes from a major purification plant, they are obligated by law to send out to every stakeholder, anybody that drinks the water, a report that tells the consumer, whether or not any particular regulated water pollutant has exceeded the maximum contaminant level established by the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's always bad if it exceeds, because the EPA does allow some exceedances. It's an average spread out over a year. So obviously, and there's a safety factor. Some can be quite huge, but typically there's at least a 10-fold up to a 10,000-fold safety factor, depending upon how we learned about the toxic ramifications of a particular chemical. So, for example, if the study was done in a rodent, then there's an extra 10-fold safety factor that gets added to the maximum contaminant level to account for interspecies variation. If the study is a chronic study versus an acute study is not as robust as a chronic study. So if the study is an acute study, you have to add another 10-fold safety factor. You have to add extra 10-fold safety factors for special groups like children and people with specific diseases like diabetes and so forth. So it's a very complex process. You can be sure, if you get your water from a municipal water supply company, that it is going to be very safe to drink. Now, part two. If you live in an area where you're drawing your water from a well, and you live in an area where there might be some groundwater contamination, you may end up with more of the biological organisms, the microbial organisms that can cause disease, and you might end up with more of the toxic chemicals, especially if your well is dug and is low-lying and you get a storm event that washes these things into the well. So it's important I know that when I worked with the National Center for Water Quality Research, we were funded entirely by Region A of the US EPA. We used to test water for anybody that wanted to have their well water tested. When I was chief toxicologist in Israel, I had the power to be able to shut down a well if I felt it was too contaminated. But municipal water supplies, you never have to worry about. Well water supplies, you have to worry a little bit more, and you must treat your well water system, or once the water comes out of the well and goes to your tap, I strongly advise that you have it filtered and use very sophisticated filtration devices. I can tell you that a Brita filter is not going to take out some of the stuff that's in well water. You really need to have a specific either nanofiltration system or you need to have a specific microfiltration or a reverse osmosis system. But you must purify your water if it's coming from a well.
Gary, you've given us a lot of good information about our local water, but part of this talk today is about the planet, the health of the planet in terms of water. And at the beginning, you mentioned that we have the same amount of water that we've had since for millions and billions of years. But there's a discrepancy in how much water we have in certain areas versus in other areas. So I'm wondering, as a person who's involved in water, you don't look at it just from the local point of view. You're looking at it from a global point of view. And what are we learning in this country in terms of dealing with water and pollution and runoffs and all of the things that you've spoken about to help people in other countries that don't have as good a water supply?
Well, you're absolutely right. I will preface this by saying that your statement that they don't have as good a water supply as we have is an absolute fact. The truth of the matter is that approximately between 1 and 2 billion people a year die from some form of waterborne disease, and most of these waterborne diseases occur in the southern hemisphere, and most of those occur in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is particularly dangerous. Do you know that 6,000 children a day die from diarrheal diseases? Can you imagine 6,000 children a day? And those diarrheal diseases are all caused by microbial organisms. So one of the lessons that we have learned is that we must get into these developing countries and educate the people there about their water supplies, but they're never going to be able to afford a massive water purification plant like we have in the United States. I mean, thousands of water purification plants. So what we do, I happen to be a member of the ambassador circle of an NGO known as the International Development Enterprise, IDE. And there's another organization here that's based in Denver called Water for People. They go to Africa, they go to these developing countries, and they help the people with what we call point of use filtration devices. Now, in some cases, they can be as simple as a ceramic vessel where the water can eventually pass through the ceramic pores. They keep just enough pore opening by using corn husk and other things of that nature, can pass through these and purify the water. We try to help these developing nations conserve their water. And one of the ways that we do it is to provide drip irrigation kits so that they don't use as much water in their irrigation processes. So it's a big education process that we have to undertake. And thank goodness for all of the NGOs, the beneficial NGOs that we have in this world that have as a mission clean drinking water. Big controversy whether or not drinking water is a basic human right or not. Now, in the United States, you don't pay for your drinking water per se. What you pay for is the infrastructure to deliver to your home clean water. So somehow or other, the water purification plants have to recoup their funding, and that's what your water bill is all about. Now, that's very nice for a developing country, but for a developed country. But for a developing country, they don't have the funding to be able to create this kind of an infrastructure. There's really only 3 ways that water can be rendered unsustainable. And that's the problem. When I said we have the same volume of water on the planet as we had 4.5 billion years ago, a major problem is that we have not sustained it properly. We have not recharged the water to a safe state. And because there's three major factors that can involve this, that can actually cause this. One is we waste water. Now think about your shower practices. Do you go in and just simply turn on the water for about 1 minute, get your body wet, soap your entire body down, having turned the water off, and then turn the water back on to rinse the soap off? When you brush your teeth, do you make sure you turn off the faucet while you're brushing your teeth? Each time that you moisten your toothbrush, you brush your teeth with the water off and then clean your toothbrush with the water on again for a couple of seconds. Rinse your mouth, through a glass of water. I mean, there's all kinds of ways. So wasting it, washing your car with your city tap water is a heinous waste. Many municipalities have made it a law now that you cannot wash your car with the city water supply. We used to irrigate golf courses with municipal water supplies. Now we don't do that anymore. We irrigate golf courses and even some farms with recycled water, where wastewater has been treated partially so that it is clean enough to irrigate the crop. I mean, after all, you're going to put the water out onto soil and dirt again, so it doesn't have to be drinking water pure. But we're learning that. Another thing that's causing unsustainable water practice is we pollute it. And once it's polluted badly, we can't necessarily always clean up that pollution. Now, we do have different ways of doing that. Like I say, we can treat wastewater and take the treated wastewater and recharge the aquifer or recharge the surface water source so that it will have to pass through the water treatment plant again. But it's better to dump partially treated wastewater back into the recharge zone than it is to simply let the water go to waste. Water is a very funny thing. Astronauts drink their urine, so there's no reason why we can't clean up wastewater and make wastewater potable, or at least semi-potable, in that we can dump it back into areas where the water is a source. And finally, we probably do not charge enough to sustain the infrastructure and all of the regulatory compliance issues that are enforced on water supplies and the detection. The EPA regulates 91 different chemicals. There's probably a couple of thousand that could be regulated, but every time, for one thing, we may not even be able to detect an unregulated contaminant. And the other thing is, unregulated contaminants may not have all been toxicologically tested so that we can establish a maximum contaminant level. So there are real problems with that, and just infrastructure funding needs. You'd be surprised how many pipes lead from the drinking water reservoir from the treatment plant that have already passed the drinking water treatment plant quite cleanly, but because of corroding pipes, it creates what we call back pressure events. Once a pipe spritzes a little hole or breaks a little hole or a crack, it causes a vacuum because, remember, the water's coming through, and because the water is coming through at a rapid velocity, it creates a vacuum, and that can suck up bacteria right from the soil and go right into a person's tap. So these render basic water supplies unsustainable, not to mention that many industries are absolute water gluts.
Gary?
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, the shirt that you're wearing right now was probably used in the neighborhood of almost 100 gallons of water to produce.
I specifically wore a blue shirt today to represent water.
Yeah, probably has more water than my brown shirt, which has more dirt. Go ahead, ask your question.
Well, you spoke about many things right now. The last thing you spoke about was lack of financial capital. You spoke about NGOs around the world. Are corporations, and is there privatization of water that's happening? Are people taking over water supplies, countries buying up lakes and rivers? And
yes.
so,
isn't that unfortunate that actually Europe, there are countries in Europe that are putting up big amounts of money to buy rights to water supplies so that they can privatize the water and charge higher rates for water. Now, I'm not saying that privatization is always bad. I mean, in some cases, we do privatize portions of water. For example, water laboratories are usually privatized to private laboratories to test to make sure that there's no microbes in the water, things like that. But the thing is that there are countries like, the city of Cochabamba, Bolivia, had a huge, huge water privatization issue where the privatization, actually Bechtel Corporation. Have you heard of Bechtel Corporation? They're a very, very large, actually chemical group. Nestle, Coca-Cola, companies like this have actually bought the water system and privatized the water so that they can have access to the water by raising the fees. And what that had accomplished, I don't know if you want to call it an accomplishment, but definitely a negative accomplishment, was it forced people from having their drinking water because they could not pay for it. And that's not just a developing country problem. The city of Detroit, Michigan, which has a water supply company owned by the government, the Detroit municipal government, shut off 40,000 addresses. I'm not talking just people. That impacted over 140,000 people, but shut off 40,000 addresses from the municipal water supply because they tried to inflate the cost in order to be able to maintain the valuable infrastructure. So 40,000 addresses were without water. And if you Google Detroit water, you'll see an awful story. And let me tell you one other thing, too. Let there be no doubt that there was some environmental injustice in that, too, because it was obviously the poor people who could no longer afford to pay the inflated prices. So we have some water problems. And we definitely, I think at the very beginning of the program, Glenn might have mentioned the new oil. And I think I understood the metaphor rather well. And I think what you meant was, are we going to fight wars over water like we fight wars over energy and oil?
Exactly.
Yeah, I had a feeling that was the case. Well, we're solving the energy crisis. It's going to take a while. We will, I mean, fracking, of course, is it's a controversial issue, but not one that I consider a very controversial issue. I think fracking is a very valid process and can be regulated very, very well. And the EPA is doing a good job, and OSHA is doing a good job of regulating the fracking practices. You know what fracking is? It's a hydraulic fracturing where they force sand down through pipes and the sand spreads out through fissures and opens the fissures so that the natural gas can escape. Well, that's a good practice because we can use that natural gas and that takes away our dependency on fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are going to run out. We've been very good at alternative forms of energy. Wind, solar, tidal. I mean, these are just examples of new alternative energies that we have that can look. All you really need energy for is to have enough power to cause a turbine to rotate around a magnet, which then produces electrons, which can light up a city. So that's why we have that's all that the oil is being used for, except for our cars, of course. That's direct combustion. But as far as a municipal's energy needs, electricity, television, laundromats, washing machines, you just name it, right down to an electric toothbrush. These things, we have the alternative energy developing. I didn't say developed, developing to be able to replace our fossil fuels. But there's a downside to that. Try to tell me, if you can, any one single alternative energy source that has not run into environmental constraints by environmental activist groups. You're Californians. You've driven out into what's that golf resort area in Southern California, Palm Springs. You've driven out to Palm Springs. I'm positive that in your drive to Palm Springs, you have seen something that you might almost call Windmill National Park, because there's so many hundreds of thousands of windmills. Now, you don't think that we just can build a windmill without using any energy. Just try to calculate the amount of steel that's in wind energy and the amount of coal-fired power plants and possibly nuclear power plants that have gone into the production of that steel. So no matter what new technology we try to develop, there is a sociological phenomenon referred to as cultural lag. The culture will always lag behind the technology. Now, there are some great water technologies coming about. One of them is desalination. Now, we have desalination plant. We're even starting to consider desalination plants in the United States, mainly for treatment of wastewater. Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Emirates, Arab Emirates, these countries actually use desalination for drinking water purposes. Israel has over 50 desalination plants for varying degrees of purification of water. So but it's a technology that is coming about that might have great validity as far as drinking water is concerned and producing drinking water. So we're keeping up with the technology or let's say this, the technology is advancing, there's still cultural lag. Treating wastewater, we're to the point where we absolutely can treat wastewater so that you can take wastewater and have it so pure you can drink it without the slightest harmful effect. It's every bit as good as the water to be delivered. So there's a great deal of hope as far as our water systems are concerned in this country. And I have what I always thought was a rather great idea. You've all heard of a carbon footprint. You've all heard a carbon footprint, right?
Sure.
Okay. Every environmentalist knows what a carbon footprint is. Obviously, the more energy intensive your company, the bigger the bigger the carbon footprint. So if you have a big carbon footprint, then you've probably heard of carbon offsets. And that is where big energy producing, big energy glut corporations pay money to help develop alternative technologies. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Well, we have a water footprint. There are many very water intensive industries. The cosmetic industry, the food industry, it takes 600 gallons to make 1 pound of beef. That's why I always believed in that book, Diet for a Hungry Planet. We don't need meat. We absolutely do not need meat. We can most of the corn that we grow in this country goes to 2 sources: fuel, ethanol, and the second is to feed animals. More of the corn that is produced in this country feeds animals than it feeds us. So that's another way of looking at it. But I believe that very, very big paper, the paper industry, tremendous water users. The textile industry, tremendous water users. Agriculture, tremendous water users, especially big monocultures, that produce one, like coffee plantations and so forth. Why can't these big companies with big water footprints pay water offsets
I
and
agree.
give that money to Cambodia and give it to other Southeast Asia and give it to Sub-Saharan Africa so that they can have cleaner water and better irrigation systems? That's a question that I ask. That's a question that I would like somebody to address on this show that ever writes in. Privatization actually ended up with civil disobedience in Cochabamba, Bolivia, with the people protesting the lack of availability of water so vociferously that they ended up kicking Bechtel, kicking Coca-Cola, and kicking Nestle right the heck out of the country and putting the water supply back into the government.
Do you think, getting back to the original question, well, not the original question, but do you think there will be water wars?
There already have been water wars. It's not even a case of will there be water wars. There already are water wars. Privatization is a classic example of a water war. It pits a population against an enterprise, against a company. There are other water wars. There's water rights. There's transboundary issues. You know that the Colorado River used to reach California, don't you? I mean, you all know that.
That was our water supply.
Yeah, and right now you've got nothing but a dry delta that looks like the Sahara.
Well,
I've been meaning to talk to you about that.
Aren't we also pumping water from the northern part of California too? Like, because I was just up in Mammoth Lakes area, and that's a huge situation going on there about LADWP using their water.
Yeah, it's a huge
draining
issue.
the lakes. Yeah.
Yes, Canada has even offered to supply some of their water wealthy, very water rich, and for a fee, they're willing to supply the United States where we need water, some water. But there's water laws. If water crosses a border, for example, the Danube River. The Danube River crosses 13 different countries. Now, there are laws. If you have a high polluting country upstream that pollutes downstream, the upstream country has to pay the downstream country. And that's what I talk about when I say water offsets. We have right here in, you have a case. It's actually Tijuana, Mexico. There's a big Tijuana watershed. The Tijuana watershed has a subwatershed in it known as the Los Laureles Canyon. It's right on the U.S.-Mexican border. Unfortunately, it flows south to north. That's where the Tijuana River flows, that goes through that watershed. It's a filthy, what they call a community populares. That means there's absolutely no guidelines for the construction of the community. They can build a community out of anything they want to. They can toss tires anywhere they want to. Well, that water, heavily polluted, flows from Mexico through the Los Laureles Canyon into one of the most sensitive estuaries in the country, and that's the Tijuana estuary in San Diego. It has come through so badly, the polluted water, that it's closed the beach along the coast of San Diego and has destroyed some of the many migratory birds that use that estuary and rook in that estuary. So those are water wars. The Israelis and the Palestinians are engaged in a huge water war. Who owns the Sea of Galilee, Lake Kinneret? Actually The Palestinians claim that part of that is theirs, and Israel claims that part of that is theirs. Who gets the share? So far, it seems as though Israel is getting the lion's share of that. So there has actually been Palestinian-Israeli joint organizations to try to sort out these water rights and to also join and partner in wastewater treatment. So, yeah, Glenn, will there be water wars? There already are water wars, and lots of them.
Speaking of water wars, and thank you for that answer, I saw a study a few months ago that said Europeans drink more bottled water than the United Nations. Than the United States. Sorry about that. And I want to ask you about bottled water. How much healthier is bottled water for us than tap water?
If your tap water supply is a municipal water treatment plant, like our Colorado's brand new Peter Binney water purification plant, or Denver Water, or whatever the name of the water company is in California, or Mekarot Water Company in Israel, and the ones in France, what you get out of the tap is every bit as good and healthy for you, and is not there has never been a study that can ever show one statistical iota of increased lifespan or health outcomes from drinking just bottled water than from drinking tap water. And the reason is what I told you at the beginning. Most of the bottled water comes from tap water sources, or some company decides to simply pass the surface water or the groundwater through a reverse osmosis system. Then they put back the magnesium and the calcium and the manganese that was taken out by that reverse osmosis, because that's purely heart unhealthy. You have to have calcium in your drinking water and magnesium in your drinking water to maintain good heart health. So the answer to your question, simple answer, I think it's ridiculous. Unless you're on a camping trip and want to carry a couple of bottles of water with you. But you know what I do when I go hiking? And I go hiking every single weekend. I hike up to the top of a place here called Green Mountain. I take my water bottle and I fill it up in the tap and I put it in the freezer overnight. And the next day I throw it into my backpack. I'm not going to pay $1.50 to $2. And if I go to a rodeo or a fair or a mountain fair or anything, any one of those kinds of big events, I'm not going to pay $3 for a pint of water to support Nestle and to support that. Do you know that many, many years ago, Perrier was actually owned by the Coca-Cola bottling company in France. And Perrier was actually on record as saying, we can market water to Americans because they're stupid enough to buy it. And
Just add a little bubble to it, and that's it.
That's what they did. They marketed it as some kind of so it became like this really posh thing, all the great restaurants and the big restaurants. Do you like a bottle of Perrier? And people paid exorbitant prices for nothing but a little bit of carbonated. As a matter of fact, 60 Minutes one time did an expose on Perrier. And Perrier claimed it's pure spring water. And I remember it so well. I think it was Morley Safer that said, well, here's the spring. And it was just a pipe coming out of the ground.
Don't you wish we would have thought of that, huh?
Yeah. Boy. And you know something, Christina, believe me. I mean, I'm what do you call a person that's a person that's develops money making schemes, an entrepreneur. Thank you. I mean, I have an entrepreneurial mind, and believe me, I've thought of 1,000 different ways that I could pull the wool over the public's eye just because I have the biochemical knowledge to really make a compelling case for certain biochemical treatments that, to sell. I could do it with the sport drink industry. I could do it with the sports bar industry. I could do it, like Pure Pro and all of those things. And Cliff bars. Boy, I could probably come up with a Cliff bar that would kick butt.
We'll talk later.
Is that what you would name it?
Kick butt bar.
Kick butt bar.
It's actually a pretty good name.
It is a good name.
It actually is a pretty good name.
Staying with bottled water for a few minutes, I don't know if you want to get into this as a topic, but there are people that I periodically listen to and talk to that swear about this special crystal spring water for their health or alkaline water, a number of different products. Are these all marketing, or is there something to this?
Glenn, it's purely marketing. It's every bit as marketing as the pH diet, the Atkins diet, all of these various diets, the low carbohydrate diet. Sure, what you do in a low carbohydrate diet is deplete your glycogen stores from your muscles and your liver. That's called hitting the wall if you're running a marathon, and letting yourself go into ketoacidosis because you're doing nothing but breaking down your protein and making ketone bodies. But as far as Crystal Springs and all of that, let them swear by it, Glenn. They're just getting their information off of absurd, ridiculous websites. These activist websites. Fluoride is just one of the most stupid issues I think that ever came out. Here's what they say. I've read this. And some companies do put fluoride in bottled water and fluoridation of water. Fluoride was a rat poison. Fluoride was used as a rat poison, and fluoride was used by the Nazis as a poison. Well, I can tell you this. You're a doctor. You might have prescribed Coumadin at some point in your life to somebody. What is Coumadin? It is warfarin. What is warfarin? Warfarin is the rat poison of choice. Does that mean stop treating people with Coumadin who need to have these blood thinners? I think it's my personal opinion is that buying any bottled water is scam. It's marketing.
I mean, I would say the only time that I would say it's mandatory is when I'm in places like parts of Asia and Mexico. I'll pay for that bottled water.
Yes, I would pay for that bottled water too. I drink a lot of beer in Mexico.
The alcohol kill anything, right?
Yeah, exactly. But sometimes I'm not even sure I trust the bottled water in Mexico unless it came from the United States. But I mean, yeah, I've had Montezuma's Revenge from a salad in Mexico City. Yeah, they don't have, but and the thing is, they even have some good water purification plants. What's killing Mexico is their deteriorating infrastructure.
You've spoken about that. We're speaking with Dr. Gary Winston, a biochemist, a toxicologist, and a water entrepreneur. And Gary, it's come to the time of the show where we always ask our guest for a health tip. I'm wondering if you have something you'd like to share with us.
Oh, sure. Gosh, there's so many thousands of health. Well, I think the last health tip I gave was avoid obesity, right?
Correct.
The last one I gave because there's just so many disease states. It's a heart condition and diabetes and so forth. And we are a pretty fat nation, let there be no doubt. But I think in keeping with the theme here, I would say a good health tip, stay hydrated. Stay hydrated. Drink 2 to 3 liters of water a day. Don't drink sugar, Pepsi Cola, Coca-Cola, sugared carbonated beverages. Substitute it with water. When you go to a restaurant and they say, would you like something to drink? Sure, have your glass of wine, but also make sure you order a glass of water on the side with a slice of lemon. Stay hydrated. For all those reasons that I gave you as to why water is important, right down to helping to dissolve your nutrients, to spread your nutrients, to maintaining your body temperature, to, let's not forget the kidneys too. Really, really does lighten the burden placed on kidneys. That's why I say drink water. Don't drink Coke. Don't drink juice. Don't drink coffee for every time you get thirsty, because all that does is make your kidney work twice as hard to filter out the stuff that's in there.
Excellent, Gary. And it stayed right on course with today's talk. I hope this was interesting and informative for all of our viewers. I'm grateful to our very special guest, Dr. Gary Winston, for returning with us and talking about this very important global health issue of water. I'd also like to thank my teachers and my healers for helping me to get through life and to continue with my journey. And I want to wish everyone a happy day and go out and have a nice drink of water until we see you again next week on Magical Medical Tour as we explore another quadrant of the healthcare galaxy. I wish you all optimal health. And thank you so much, Gary.
Pleasure is all mine. It's always a joy to see you both and talk to you. And actually, this was fun.
Great. Bravo. Thank you so much, Dr. Winston and Dr. Woolman, and of course, our Yoga Hub team for making this possible, and to each and every one of you for joining us in this new platform of education and information. We're always grateful for your continuous support and look forward to hearing your feedback on how we can serve you better. We invite you to join us live on Tuesdays for Magical Medical Tour at 10:30 a.m. Pacific, 1:30 Eastern. Wednesdays for Trinity of Life at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, followed every other week with Flowing into Awareness with Anatara. May I remind you that you can connect with Dr. Glenn Woolman by following him on Twitter at Glenn Woolman, and of course through his own website, glennwoolman.com, where you can learn about his metaphor square breath. Again, thank you so much for joining us. And please, we are always looking for your feedback and suggestions. Give us a call, 818-LETS-TALK, 818-LETS-TALK. Until next time, namaste. YHTV's Trinity of Life. Come join me, Christina Suzama, as I journey to find the many modalities that support individuals, from children to adults to elders, with topics ranging from health and wellness, meditation, and inspirational stories. I invite you to visit yogahub.tv every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern.
And I tell my patients, who come in for a cut or a bruise or whatnot, and their blood pressure's like soaring and they're forgetting to take their meds. And I was like, are you ready to die? Sometimes that's unfortunately the route I have to take, or you need to take control of this. So, and different people have high blood pressure for different reasons. But it was a story that, it was an experience that changed me. And maybe also had a lot to do with why I went into medicine, but it was a learning experience, so